Welcome to the Global ESG Leadership Organization's discussion about responsible digital governance. And this is an important conversation with an important panel. Our goals for today are to talk about moving the idea of digital governance from something that's aspirational to something that is operational, that could be an architecture for the future. AI and digital systems are now shaping global value chains. Many of these tools we use still lag an appropriate shaping, an appropriate way of managing them. And we're going to hear a lot of ideas about the way that we could go about that, both from our esteemed panel as well as from some of our online contributors. And we're going to have an opportunity to examine some of the complexities of these technologies. And we are so fortunate to be joined by an esteemed panel today. We are joined by Mr. Terry Thornton, who is the Honorary President of Education for ESGIN. So thank you for coming and sharing and for your leadership in this organization. We have Robert D.F. Thomas, who is the Senior Risk Manager, Environmental Strategy for Amazon. He is also an adjunct professor of law at Fordham University. We have got Sherman Kong, who is an independent digital governance specialist, as well as the former co-founder of the GovStack initiative, and also Professor Jennifer Terliak, who is president of Kuru Labs and a lecturer at MIT Sloan, as well as an executive fellow at the Harvard Business School. And I am so pleased to be facilitating for you today, as well as joining the conversation. My name is Monica Sanders. I am a adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University and the founder of the Undivide Project, which is an organization that looks at climate risk and digital access, and also a senior contributor at Forbes.com, hopefully going to engage with some of you all at different points. What I would like to do now is turn it over to our esteemed panelists for a very quick introduction. Sherman, I'd like to start with you.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this very dynamic panel. I come from more of a digital governance background, so I'd love to see how this intertwine with the sustainability angle that other, panel experts will contribute, and how to shape my thinking and philosophy around how digital and climate intersect. I started as an engineer, actually. I used to look at, hardware chips, so my journey in tech started in a very, very small scale and now in the macro sense in global policies. And I've done some work in global health as well. So very interested to see also how health kind of intersect with all the conversations we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherman. Terry, may I come to you?
Yes, yes. Hello. So for me, it gets a little personal. So I grew up in a deaf household. So both my parents were deaf. And one of the top indicators for success as a child is being read to at home, which couldn't happen for me. So what my parents did was buy one of the first, they call them closed captioning TVs. Those are the TVs with the subtitles. This is brand new technology that they spent money they didn't have on just to get it in front of me so I could read along with the programming. So I like to say that Sesame Street taught me how to read. And Sesame Street is a big children's program in the United States and also some other countries. But educational programming delivered with digital technology really gave me, a boost, a leg up. Let me start at the level of my peers and change the trajectory of my life. So in some capacity through my whole career, digital education, digital content has been a part of that. And you can't have that without digital governance, right? You can't have good content, accurate content, delivered content when you need it without good governance. So governance has been a passion of mine for the past several years as well. And starting my career creating some of the first online ESG courses in the world, e-learning back when it was scary, to now where I build a lot of AI governance frameworks, content governance frameworks, and responsible, digital governance frameworks, what those look like and how they actually get implemented in real life. Thank you. Love to be here.
Thank you, Terry. And by the way, did you know that Sesame Street is available in more than 150 countries and 70 languages? So how many people here have
Wow.
some awareness of Sesame Street, real or virtual hands? So again, the spread of digital governance and how far we can spread good ideas if we do this right, yes?
Exactly.
I would like to come to you next for your brief introduction.
Sorry, was that me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry, I didn't hear. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Turlick. Pleased to be here. I'm tuning in live from Toronto, Canada. And in terms of my journey, it all started when I was running a kids' education business that teaches STEM topics such as coding and robotics. And we had the wildfire smoke in Toronto, Canada. And kids asked me why they couldn't go outside. I had the opportunity to have that business be acquired and went on to focus on climate. And specifically, I'm interested in and do research on minimizing AI's climate risks and how to think about governing AI in the age of climate change. So I've taught about AI for energy solutions and sustainable AI at MIT, and also recently released a paper on the net climate impact of AI. Excited to be here.
Right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We're going to have a lot to talk about around climate and the AI and the risk associated with it. So excited to hear your comments. Robert, last but not least, may we have your introduction, please?
It's hard to follow Jennifer, but good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. Thankful to be a part of this respective panel. As my journey as an engineer as well, currently serve as a senior risk manager for Amazon and the former head of global environmental compliance for all of Apple Inc. In particular, as also as a law professor teaching ESG at Fordham Law School. I'm thankful to have this respective opportunity and leveraging that lens and that scope of ESG, but specifically digital governance as it relates to leveraging technology coming from the both tech industries and how that can be amicable and transitioning regulatory compliance, strategic initiatives, and how that can permeate across organizations. So excited to be here and thankful for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are grateful to have you here with us. For our audience, just a reminder, we are going to have a Q&A with the panel. However, we'd also like to hear from you. So if you have comments or questions, please drop them in the chat. And also a little bit later this morning, we have 12 distinguished online contributors who will join us for 1-minute additions after the panel is over with. So we're going to hear a lot of ideas, a lot of voices, and spend a lot of time interrogating some of these critical questions. I would love to start, and Sherman, I'm going to start with you, but this is for the whole panel. When we talk about work across global governance spaces, as well as where public digital infrastructure, digital public infrastructure intersects with these concepts of AI safety, data literacy, and not forgetting that we're in a UN Science and Technology Forum, so we want to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a lot of things that we need to unpack when we're talking about a framework. So let's start with the big question. What would a credible global framework for responsible digital governance need to include? And I would start by saying some acknowledgement of the SDGs, but what should it include, Sherman?
Yeah, thank you, Monica, for the question. I think those of us in this international digital norm space have seen a lot of frameworks published. There are a lot of principles and ethical guidelines and so on. But one always thing that picks up country partners and institutional partners afterwards is the translatability of this. So how do we go from framework to practice and to potentially acts and policies and laws? Those are things that kind of determine whether a global framework is actually actionable. And so I think the core driving principle in my mind, from my experience of looking at different frameworks, is the implementability of this. And if you dig into specific principles around some common languages on global digital frameworks, I think it was a popular term a little bit while back. I'm not sure why it's not as being used as often, but in the UN context, there was a lot of use of the phrase "leave no one behind." Uh, um, yeah, most recently, and it entails making sure that everybody has universal access, rights, opportunities in the digital age. But I think you can also catch, now that we're in this ESG context, the term "no one," because we're only looking at consumers and individuals. And then how do we incorporate that into the complex systems of ecology and environment now? So it's not only about accountability to people, but accountability to environment as well. And so unless there's um, proper framing of how environment becomes a receiving constituent in the context of accountability, I think the framework might be, lacking in that aspect of any global sense. So that would be my take on what makes it inclusive for everything and everyone.
Mhm. Other panel members, would you like to comment? Go ahead, Terry.
Oh, I definitely will get into this more, the applicability of the framework, right? Because if you have principles without process, it's really just words, right?
Mhm.
Without that applicability, without the operationality, you really can't dig out into how things actually work. And there needs to be room for each company that follows any kind of framework to dig down deep, because the framework's just going to give you general guidelines. Do this, do this, do this. And too often, companies look at process in that way as a concept, right? It's a design. It's, oh, this happens and this happens and this happens, but it often doesn't match the reality of how it actually happens, right? So these frameworks, you can check it off, but if it's not happening on the ground, right, then there's a disconnect, and that disconnect, especially when you talk about digital responsibility, when you start talking about things like AI, getting that into it, with that disconnect represents risk, right? And then so when you're thinking about automation, you're thinking about AI, it's not solving that risk, it's just automating the risk, right? So that's even more out of your control. So, we'll definitely dig into that more as we go along, but the frameworks are just that. It's not the end all and be all. You have to allow, or companies have to take it upon themselves to really dig down and say, okay, this is how it maps to what we do. Not, oh, there's a check mark. We check it. We do that, but not without any real understanding of how you really do that.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. I appreciate that. And then for those of us who work in or with parliaments and legislatures, it's the process and the norms that companies act on or don't act on that help inform how we're going to do legislation and do this part of the governance framework, which is the government part of it, is like, how are we going to govern around this? This is a great opportunity to turn to you, Jennifer, and talk about the intersection of environment and AI and how should we be thinking about the net climate impact, and to Sherman's point about how do we make the environment a constituent in this conversation.
Thanks so much for the question. Yeah, so this is what my MIT research is on. And I would say there's a couple things to look at. So we need to first look at the climate harms. AI is causing a lot of climate harms like emissions, waste, pollution, and so forth. But it also has the potential to offer certain benefits like optimizing energy, potentially reducing emissions. So how should we think about that? Well, a cost benefit analysis would show it as, benefits minus costs. But it's not as simple as that when it comes to climate, because a ton of carbon that we emit today has way more of an impact in the environment and on climate change than a ton of carbon that we emit 20 years from now, because it stays in the atmosphere that much longer. So right now, society is kind of using AI for climate solutions, taking the bet that it may hopefully reduce emissions later on, but it may not. Right now, AI is around 1% of emissions, but is projected to grow by 2030 to 4 to 9%, or perhaps even as high as 20%. And our best estimates of how much AI could reduce emissions is only as low as 1.5 to 4%. So that's why I think regulation and policies and laws are so important. And right now, there's a large absence of those. There's not much regulation or law at all in the US or Canada regarding AI or AI's environmental impact. So I think that's one of the most important areas to look at.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And did I see that you have a paper out?
Yes, we have a new paper out. So it builds on my mid-career MIT thesis, and it's on the net climate impact of AI, looking at current costs and future potential benefits. It'll be a chapter of a book soon, but we released the preprint yesterday in time for the STI Forum.
Congratulations. I saw it pop up on LinkedIn. I'll admit that I didn't have time to read it last night, but I'm looking forward to reading it. And also congratulations on it being part of a larger book, which is what we need. We cannot do governance without the science. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Robert, we're talking about governments, environment, but a big piece of this is, when we talk about how we're going to approach things, it's who's in charge and who's paying for it are the critical questions. And how do we finance this? And so, what do you think that investors and corporate leaders are still struggling to understand in this conversation about digital governance? Like, what signals should be included in a framework for investors and corporate leaders?
What signals? So in particular, I would say that organizations can focus on uh, narrowing their scope and embedding specific strategies or tactics or frameworks, such as how to integrate compliance or integrate AI into their daily operations. So this would include, for example, embedding regulatory checks into their workflows, right? This would also include automating controls to ensure validation, as well as ensuring that risk assessments are performed according to safeguard operational processes. Another aspect would be, I would say, cross-functional ownership. Um, Assign compliance responsibilities for non-operational subgroups. For example, you think about subgroups like my own, EHS, procurement, and legal and facilities, to ensure that our risks are managed and governed at real times across organizational policy. Another, I would say, as we're speaking to digital governance, I would also speak to leveraging technology and data. This would include automating and monitoring compliance requirements, of course. And then as we're talking and speaking about AI, leveraging AI to identify potential risk in operations and non-operational functions. Another aspect that organizations and companies focus on is regulatory audits and monitoring. So for example, you can continue to conduct routine audits across departments, identify non-compliance, but more importantly, I would say that having an effective audit program articulates the health of an organization from a perspective of financial accuracy, operational efficiency, and of course, managing the overall risk and compliance programs of an organization. So that's a holistic approach. And those are the maybe four respective areas that an organization can focus on to leverage AI moving forward.
Thank you for that. So to Terry's earlier point, you can have a framework, you can have a vision, but then how do we change that to a process? And you've articulated a holistic approach to how do we develop processes to get us there, which is important for corporate leaders, but also if you're in other kinds of organizations. So let's not forget that process is just as important if you're in an NGO or an intergovernmental organization or an INGO, is thinking about what are the processes by which we're going to start implementing some parts of these frameworks. So thank you for laying that out so clearly, because each one of those is an action step. And Jenny, I'm so glad that this is going to be written down somewhere so that we actually can go back and read things like Robert's contributions and actually use them in our work. Terry, I'd like to come back to you now. We've talked about how you began in this space, and we know that you've worked for a major global technology company on this. What does it take to translate ESG, digital governance principles into operating systems that actually work? So it's taking the process and making sure people, to be perfectly frank, do what you need them to do in order for things to become reality.
Yes, I love this question. And actually, I have one quick follow-up. So, Jennifer is saying there isn't a lot of frameworks out there. The governments are moving kind of slow. Don't wait. Go do this now. Do what Robert's talking about. Go ahead and get the journey started now because you don't want to be flat-footed in terms of this. And you want to be thinking this through strategically before it's put on you. So one word of there about the urgency. In terms of moving this from, the awareness to actually being embedded, I'll pivot a moment because I just saw this morning. A popular story has come out now that a um, a company's AI agent within like 9 seconds wiped out their entire database. And then they said, why did you do this, agent? And the agent responded, I violated my principles. And so it's not enough to talk about it, not enough to check the boxes, not enough to tell the agent, hey, don't do this. Because as anyone knows, when you tell it to not do something, it still can do something, right? For me, it's the M dash. It's that extra long dash in almost every AI communication, LLM communication. For years, I've tried to get it to stop. It keeps telling me it's going to stop. It doesn't stop, right? So it's understanding what you're asking it to do and how it can do it, right? It's not just throwing AI on top of everything. So and I'll go back to what I said before, the principles, um, the frameworks, if you don't have the process or understand the process with it, then it's just words, right? And you can't, there's too much risk. There's too much risk at stake to depend on that. And so you really have to do in terms of operationalizing uh, AI governance, digital governance throughout a value chain is to decompose the process down to its base components, right? So you have these processes, you have the concept, you really have to break it down to all its individual steps where you can describe each step with one sentence. Because if you can describe each step with one sentence, you can then ask that step of questions, right? Does this need a human? Does it need an AI agent? Maybe a simple automation. And then you can ascribe and deploy the right tool for the right step, right? So that's what this other company kind of missed, right? It didn't break down all the steps that this AI agent touches and where the accountability is there, right? And so it's not enough to tell the agent, don't do it. You just have to have the risk boundaries in there too. So you really look at every step, breaking it down to one sentence, right? And when you do that, you'll find a lot of surprises. You'll find bottlenecks, right? You'll find, oh, this is where we have to have human oversight, right? Oh, this can be automated. And you'll also find you don't need AI for everything, right? There's simple automations you can do. So it's not about, when you think responsible digital governance, it's not about, how do we use AI, right? It's about the right digital tool. And it can be AI, but finding the appropriate tool for the appropriate step, right? That is what gets lost. A lot of folks say, just throw AI on it. Just throw this on it. Just plug it in. This is where you get that risk that really comes out and the risk profile of each of these steps. And when you're embedding it, I keep talking process and
Right.
tools, right? These are two separate skill sets that a lot of folks in the company, because of how companies are set up, don't have within one function, right? You have IT, tool expertise, right? They understand the technology, but then you have the business itself. They understand the process, or they should, right? They understand how things get from A to B to C to the end. So you need to bring these folks together, And this is what I'm doing right now, actually, for MSCI. We launched an AI process engineer certification, right? The word engineer is in there,
I'm
and
going to interrupt you really quickly.
oh yeah,
For some of our audience may not be familiar with MSCI and its function, so give
yes,
us 2 sentences on what
thank you.
MSCI is and what it does, and then you can tell us what you do there.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So MSCI is a data company. They take a lot of financial data, they collect it, they package it, and they sell it for analyses, for indices, things like that. So it's a fintech company that takes financial data and produces that into products for sale for investors. And pretty much all investors around the world somehow touch MSCI. So the process is very important there. And data governance is very important there. And what we've done there is pull together the business savvy folks and the IT folks together and train them together on the same thing around AI. So at first you have the business folks that are kind of like this, the word engineer is in it. I'm not technical, I'm not an engineer. They soon found out and understood that what they contribute is understanding the process. They can break down the process. And then our IT folks supporting them and saying, this AI element we can use here. We can use automation here. We need a human here, right? That doesn't happen in isolation without each other, right? So when you're
Right.
talking about embedding, it's breaking down the processes, understanding the processes before you start assigning it. It's before you start rolling out these tools and understanding the accountability and explainability of each of those steps. Yeah.
And that's important. Don't leave out the human element. Take a holistic approach, which are points
Hmm.
that in different ways, both your colleagues Sherman and Robert have made, as well as Jennifer in bringing in the environmental aspect of this. For the whole panel, we've talked about the importance of process, the importance of various stakeholders in the process being surfaced and acknowledged. And we began to touch on who or what should be included. From you all's individual vantage points, I would like for us to do a little bit of issue spot. Where do you all see the governance gaps that we face right now? Is it about lack of rules? Is it about lack of measurement, AKA engagement with the various sciences? Is it about lack of accountability, as Terry started to point out, or lack of awareness of accountability, institutional capacity, or a lack of inclusion? To Sherman's earlier point, we went straight away from no one left behind, right? So I'm going to ask it again a little bit shorter. What's the biggest governance gap we're facing right now? Lack of rules, lack of measurement, lack of accountability, lack of institutional capacity, or lack of inclusion? What do you all think?
All of
Go
it?
ahead. I saw you come off mute.
I can go first. I think it's
Okay.
lack of laws because I think companies aren't necessarily, I'll talk about it from the climate side since that's my area. I think companies aren't going to voluntarily reduce their climate impacts of AI out of the goodness of their heart because they're trying to maximize their profits and maximize their AI. And right now, that's resorting to some of them using jet engines to fuel their AI, for example. And it seems, although I'd be curious on other perspectives, that there's a real absence of laws that limit them from doing that. And so it seems we need laws in order to stop them taking those actions. And hopefully they would go and be above and beyond them and be more ethical than that. But I think at a bare minimum, we need something to hang our hat on to say, hey, you can't do that.
Yeah,
I'd like
I would
to respond.
absolutely agree with that in terms of if it matters, then you measure it. So, companies will measure everything they have to report on, right? But they're not going to measure voluntarily the negative impacts they have on the environment, the externalities, right? So they're not going to
Right.
go out and measure that. So the lack of legal framework for them to measure and report on is a major, major issue.
Well, then we should hear from a lawyer or someone who teaches law, right, Robert?
I want to counter you, Jennifer, by saying we're getting there, right? I think about ESG from a derivative of reporting to the SEC, right? But at the same time, we now have CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, right? Which has been mandated by the EU. So specifically for all organizations who have corporations or they're operating in those respective capacities, they're required now to show non-financial disclosure and financial disclosure. So think about it from the perspective of your 10K in conjunction with your sustainability or ESG report. So though the pendulum shifts continually politically, however, but I think the rest of the world is picking up the respective steps. So I think we're getting there from a perspective of having regulatory engagement and enforcement, because this is a regulatory requirement that organizations are required to satisfy over the next 4 to 6 years. So we're getting there where these things are going to be required, and it's a holistic approach. It's covering environmental, from air, water, waste, to social initiative, from workspace, affected communities, and of course, governance, right? Business ethics and how organizations produce their respective resources. So I think from a regulatory perspective, we're getting there, and it's no longer allowing organizations to, what you would say, greenwash and just provide a sustainability report. They now have to match their money with their mouth, right? From a non-financial perspective and a financial perspective. That's just want to add that to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that is important. And I just want to, with your help, Robert, remembering that we have an audience from all over the world. So in the US, we're very familiar with the Form 10K that has us put in both quantitative and qualitative entries about our company's behavior. But for some of our international audience, could you tell them a little bit more about what the Form 10K is and why that's so important?
Yes, ma'am. It is think about it from a perspective of EBITDA. It's an organization's of financial accuracy. It's the health of an organization's economic resources, right? So in particular, for those things that are deemed material, and material is a broad definition. It could be a risk, it could be financial impact, it could be competitive behavior, a code of conduct, a number of different things, those things that are deemed material. An organization must articulate their financial health, as well as their EBITDA, their earnings before tax and amortization, to their board of directors, as well as to the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission, that provides a monetary value for those organizations who participate on the New York Stock Exchange. So if you're a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange, you're required to submit a 10K to the U.S. SEC for material matters.
Yeah. And if you are an international company with a subsidiary, it's a 20F. If you're in the UK or the EU, it's your annual report. Our friends in Canada, I do believe it's a 40F, or it may have changed. Remember, it's been a few years since I've been in-house counsel on this kind of thing. But what's important about that is that there is a text entry. And for people who work with AI or automated processes, natural language processing will sometimes come in and pick up what you say about, did we do a social impact program? Did we incorporate certain positive environmental behaviors into our company's processes, to Terry's point? What are our governance systems, to what Jennifer and Robert and Sherman have been talking about? So as we're laying out what do processes look like, don't forget that there are some required governance structures, and I'm going to say governance with a little g, right? And we're trying to get to big G, that are already in place that we could be thinking about how we can leverage as people who are either inside these organizations or trying to influence these organizations. Now, Sherman, I want to go back to our original panel question because I do want to hear from you. What are we missing in this conversation about a governance framework?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, I'm gonna go a little bit philosophical because, in the norms and principles space, there's a lot of sensible notions of what should be applied in terms of ethics and principles and values. I think maybe one missing element is this notion of aligning shared values between industry and public good and social progression and benefits. I think just because of the different driving forces, you're not always aligned in terms of the goals of an organization or company versus what is the holistic, benefits that a whole society should um, uh, get behind when it comes to digital services, digital technologies, and the digital future. And now you feel that tension even more with the hyper development in AI. I guess in some sense that, what is the sensibility around this rapid deployment of tools and engagement um, to consumers and users when it comes to, these kind of models. So I think sensibility is, I think, one kind of philosophical element that I would like to, any kind of framework to kind of underline. Um, well, because, there's also the real definitions of what governance is. If you have a zoning committee talking to a local community about whether a road should be built in the neighborhood, and if the decision is not, then it's not built. But in the digital, space, it seems like we're always constantly catching up on what already exists or what has been put out there by the market, versus just having real conversations on what is the, tangible social and human benefits when it comes to putting up something else in the frontier of technology. So we're always kind of constantly governing something after the fact. So I hope that a kind of shared sensibility into what should be mutually beneficial from a corporate standpoint and from a social standpoint to pursue next, and some kind of governance structures or advisory structures around that. That would be an interesting mechanism to kind of experiment with or see.
Okay. Can I stay with you just a moment on this theme of the sublime and philosophical?
Sure.
In the concept note, leading up to this event, our colleagues noted a common language of trust. No matter what we come up with, people have to believe in it. They have to trust it to want to do something. In your work across thinking about all of these things, because you're incredibly interdisciplinary in your work, which I appreciate very, very much. What's the common language? What are some of the common actions that engender trust? What should we be communicating to get people to want to trust in any framework that we come up with?
Yeah, I'll draw inspiration back to Terry and other panelists' points on how they operationalize something as, you know, um, elusive as trust. And I think also I feel kind of hypersensitive right now on the word trust. I think you can see how we're kind of um, losing trust a bit in the global context, not speaking only from people to states or people to corporations, but also now even, to each other, exacerbated by all the noise around social media platforms and such. And you start to kind of have to regain or relearn what does that mean to trust. But I feel like there's a way to encode trust. There's a way to operationalize trust, and in international norms and standardization context, you can embed that into architectural references and frameworks. At least from implementing the technology itself, you can talk about making sure that you use things that are interoperable so the systems can communicate with one another in a trusted and safe and secure way, using standards that are adopted. You can use open standards as well. You can even have data spaces that I think EU is trying to emphasize now, or trying to promote the fact that you can have a legislative confined space where organizations and country governments can share data in a federated way, and it build trust that way in a functional way. I guess where you kind of look towards the future is where you might have blind spots that you cannot operationalize yet, and then trust becomes harder to achieve. And I think I like the word faith a little bit more than trust in that context, because you don't necessarily know how to foresee all the things that you can encode and operationalize, and making sure that entities and countries and corporations can operate in a trusted environment in a society. So when the when you cannot actionably implement trust, how do you make sure that there's still faith that country will do right by, or companies will do right by what is the um, social values of a people, of a country, and that gets into more the ethical and philosophical issues and debates. And I think it's at least encouraging to see now, um, because we're being constantly kind of pushed by making sure that AI has been deployed well. There's the think tanks and research work looking into AI intersection with human flourishing. At least there's one kind of philosophical goals we're trying to achieve to make sure that AI is being, steered towards a more beneficial direction. So I think that's where we'll leave trust and faith kind of intertwine in that sense.
Yeah, and that leads us to action. And of course, getting back to what's the foundation of both trust and even faith? And it's evidence, right? Or at least me speaking from an extreme bias as an attorney, right? How do we make a case something? How do we convince people to trust in my narrative or trust in the decision? It's by providing some sort of evidence. And we do have the capacity to do that. And perhaps I'm being impacted because some of this erosion of trust in public institutions is we're watching public institutions not engage with science and facts in a way that has been normative in the past few decades or centuries. And so how do we bring that back into it? Because that's an important component of this. And speaking on science and evidence, I'd like to come back to Jennifer and talk more about how do we bring in, and you'll hear in my question some of the things that cut against trust and faith, is how do we bring into our frameworks ways of accounting for direct harms? Because we hear a lot about bias in AI, we talk a lot about indirect human harms, which a lot of times comes in the form of environmental harm, as well as things like energy demand, water use, competition for different kinds of infrastructure. Like we might have been wanting to do something else with that jet fuel and those jet engines right now. How do we account for that in our frameworks?
Yeah, great question. So I'll talk about it a bit from the climate side and then more broadly. Some of the things we're looking to combat, some of the harms. Right now, data centers are already 20% of emissions in Ireland, and some of the biggest data centers under construction across the world today are projected to have more emissions than whole countries. I'll just let that hang for a second. A data center with more emissions than a whole country. There's a data center that's being built right now that's half the size of Manhattan, for example. So how do we combat those? Well, I think first is to establish standardized procedures for measuring the environmental impact of AI so that everyone's working towards the same numbers and we're not having different reporting. And we also need to require companies to disclose those direct environmental consequences of AI, including transparency of emissions from hardware, software, and infrastructure such as data centers. And in terms of that, we also need to require environmental impact assessments, as well as report energy consumption. And even Germany has taken the step of informing customers of the energy consumption from AI that's directly attributable to them, which I think is a really interesting step. And then we also need to go beyond that by promoting AI literacy and awareness of AI's environmental costs. And I really like, so bringing it back to non-climate, I really like Jeffrey Saviano from Harvard's framework. It's a pyramid of ethical progression, which talks about going from the base of a pyramid where it's non-compliance, companies not complying with laws, to going above that to reactive and basic compliance with laws. And then beyond that, taking ethical actions above and beyond what's there in terms of laws and becoming ethical stewards.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And then when we're talking about ethical stewardship and compliance, there are some practical ways that we can get there. There's, I'm coming to you, Terry, and then to you, Robert. So this is for both of you guys. When we're talking about how an organization matures, its ability to be a steward and how it creates processes towards that stewardship that Jennifer was just speaking of is an indicator. And also the mirror image of that is avoidance of being aware of greenwashing and avoiding greenwashing in its processes. So how do we look at being a steward as part of organizational maturity and avoiding greenwashing? So I'd like to come to you, Terry, for a little bit, and then come to you, Robert.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and something Sherman said really struck a chord with me is how fast things are moving, right? So when I work with companies, when we talk about digital responsible governance, these are like living documents, and they're set out to be that way because things are constantly changing, right? So there has to be flexibility, and maybe, I'm talking out loud here. I'm learning along with you here from the other panelists. Um, Maybe it's also along with the difficulty with legislation, right? Because um, uh, being flexible, being resilient to all these different changes, always trying to catch up is a real challenge. So what he also said about that faith and trust. So what are the underlying, what ties everything together in terms of your outcomes? What's your North Star? What are we trying to achieve here? And having processes allowed to be changed and constantly reinvented. And there's new AI tools, there's new this, to be able to absorb all that and to really still deliver on what you want it to deliver at the end of it. So it's not being so rigid. Um, it's a balance, right? So you have to understand the processes, you have to get granular, but you can't be rigid about it. And it's a difficult balance, right? It's very, very difficult to walk that line, especially for companies that aren't used to doing that. So I would say that's kind of step one if you want to, kind of go above and beyond, because what is that? That definition changes. What is above and beyond? When the next thing comes around, you solve this problem, then the next problem comes along. So it's really having those principles and having flexibility to adjust your processes and build as you go and all of that, and have the faith that that's doing the right thing. Not, oh, we built up, legislation told us to this, we did this, and now there's this new thing going on. That was rubbish, right? So it's that faith, and I like that word from Sherman, that faith that this is where we're trying to go as a company ideal, and this is the framework and how we get there, being flexible and adjustable and adaptable along the way, and that's much harder than I'm saying than the way I'm spelling it out right now. So, Robert, I would love to absolutely hear from your perspective, especially around what makes a good steward and all the changes that your companies have gone through.
Sure, sure. Thank you, Terry. I think about starting as the global head of environment compliance for Apple. In particular, I was the first ever global head of environmental compliance for all of Apple in 50 years. So you can imagine, people think about Apple and you think about, I call her the great Lisa Jackson. She was the former head of the EPA. But starting the organization, my manager was the vice president of research and development. My skip level was the CFO. It's the same person I had to allocate resources from. So the first thing I would say is having a clear vision and setting strategic initiatives to permeate throughout an organization, right? It's an old saying that without a vision, the people will perish. So to communicate that vision to an organization, to get them to invest and show financial um, uh, resources that will allocate new processes, new procedures, new technology, a new team, right? I had to build a new team from scratch, right? And to govern, I mean, I think I had about 10 different topic areas over that was specific over 27 different countries. So how do I get an organization to buy in? But when you think about that, that comes from a perspective of a corporate governance structure. So providing a vision, having a respective strategy, having a targeted model, the organizational design, having good governance and reporting, specific, efficient on technology and processing people. It's a holistic approach, right? There's no one clear answer, but to galvanize a whole organization and to move it forward, that's what it's going to take, right? And it speaks, I think, when I first started the organization, I typically operate from a governance perspective. And the best framework that I saw was SASB. And it's the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards. They provide a conceptual framework around my topic area, which is environmental, and that goes from greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, energy management, water, wastewater, a number of different topics. So how to take that holistic conceptual approach, apply a strategy to it, get buy-in because it's a top-down approach that allows the organizations to permeate those policies, those strategic initiatives, etc. But again, there's no one clear answer to that. Select a framework that's applicable for you and for your respective industry. Allocate your resources and get buy-in and move your initiative forward. But that's the posture and approach I've taken in larger organizations, and that's the same posture and approach I'm taking now as a new associate at Amazon as well. So that's my response.
Thank you so much for that, for both of you all. And we have got a really interesting comment and question from Mika No from the Korean Government of Ministry, Culture, Sports and Tourism. And she's also the AI Art Forum chair and co-founder, whom I actually got to meet virtually earlier, and I'm looking forward to future conversations. She's adding, that there is a cultural dimension to this discussion. When we talk about responsible digital governance, we often overlook that AI systems are trained on culturally uneven data sets. So the question here is, how can governance frameworks integrate cultural data rights and representation as part of ESG or digital responsibility standards? So this is to everyone on the panel. How can governance frameworks integrate cultural data rights and representation as part of ESG or digital responsibility standards?
I don't have an answer. I hope someone else on the panel does, but I do have an example of how important this question is, right? So I've been working with AI for several years now in the first LLMs that came out, and they've improved, but we're not there yet. So if you ask, for example, and I do this when I'm with companies in France, here's a question around ESG to an LLM around in English, detailed, gives you the answer. Now, here's the same question in French and give me the French answer, and it's a different answer. It's something actually a little bit more outdated, right? It's less trained on French language. It's less trained to deliver the same. So you have a gap there, right? You're getting a better answer in English, which obviously, if you've ever been to France, would infuriate people, where you have an inferior answer in French than you do in English, right? And you can apply that to a lot of things, in terms of access to the content that comes out of it, what it's being trained on, who it's being trained on, what biases it's being trained on. You can Google it. You will see a lot of stories around, what does a CEO look like, right? It probably won't be a woman that pops up, right? So it's you have a lot of these biases and things inherent in it. And I'm really glad that question was asked because I would love to hear myself how we can engage with it. Because so far I've been able to, point out the challenge, but we really do need to start thinking about the answer.
Yeah, and while your colleagues are thinking and raising their hands, I'll add some from my own experience. And Mika, sometimes the answer is in the doing as a researcher. I think the key word that Terry keeps pointing out is on the training, is particularly when we're dealing with AI, is asking who is doing the training and how do we set frameworks so that the training is more open and more representative of the human experience. Because right now, whether you're working in the US or Europe, there's a specific subset of science that is represented. There's a specific subset of culture and gender that is represented. And so really interrogating who is doing the training and the creating, right? And I will flag it is yet to be seen whether this will work or not. So I'm being vulnerable here. We're working on a climate prediction tool specifically. I'm from Louisiana, which some of you guys may have read, that's going to have to do a managed retreat. It is now the most vulnerable area to sea level rise in the world. And we have been working on a predictive tool. I made a point of hiring software engineers and social science researchers from Cajun and Creole and indigenous communities so that when working on natural language processes is exposed to different ideas. So a great person can build an algorithm, but can that great person build an algorithm that understands the way Cajun people talk about sea level rise versus the way some now adopted Northeasterner from an Ivy League university talks about sea level rise? It's not going to be the same. And so the output's going to be different. I don't know. To be discovered, because this is the nature of research. It may not work. It might work. We'll write a paper about it and maybe come and talk about it on another forum. Other members of the panel, would you like to weigh in now that I've fainted a bit and given you something to push back on or talk about? Please jump right in.
Sure, I can go. That sounds really neat, Monica, and I'd be very curious to hear more about that. This isn't really my area, but I have heard some interesting thoughts about it. I want to do a plug for the book Empire of AI by Karen Howe, for those who haven't checked it out. She's an amazing writer, speaker, and person. And I heard her speak recently and have been reading that book. And one example I really liked that she talked about is actually in in working with an indigenous community, folks who were creating an app, went to that community and asked what did they want and how they wanted the data to be used, and ensured to build towards their desires and specifications, and then checked in throughout the entire project to ensure that what they were building was what was wanted and that the data was being used and governed the way the community wanted. So I thought that was a really neat example, and that could expand from there, for example, for other different communities as well.
Thank you. That is a great book. I put it in the chat for those of you all who may not have the link to it. And also so it can be included in our artifact of this meeting. So we've got a couple of other great comments in here from Yenis. And I hope I'm saying that correctly. I hope I didn't Latinize your name. If I did, please excuse me. I believe AI literacy would be a factor that affects how a majority of corporate people use AI at work and how much they can safeguard the political accuracy and integrity. Those are great words because when you're thinking about how you build algorithms, or from my perspective as a lawyer, when you're looking at that as an evidence, it's like the accuracy, the veracity, the validity, how quickly it was done, velocity. Those are important things to look at when we're talking about frameworks and how we reverse engineer. And then from HSU, is this a university? Good evening, Professor Thomas. So this is for you, Robert. As digital transformation accelerates, AI's energy footprint is growing. From RDG's perspective, how can we integrate digital decarbonization, quote unquote, into global environmental compliance frameworks without stifling innovation? So how do we bring in digital decarbonization into compliance, but still keeping the integrity of the innovative ecosystems? Robert.
That's a good one. That's a mouthful. Specifically, when I think about environmental compliance and lessons learned from governance, I think in decarbonization, you think about it from a holistic perspective again. I think about it from a proactive risk management perspective, the lens of transparency, and then accountability. Something I love that Jennifer spoke about was the data centers and their respective impact. Working for Apple, we had maybe 12 different respective data centers around the world. And the concern at that time was criteria air pollutants. Now it's morphed into decarbonization. But when I think about it, I'll take a holistic approach at this one as well. You think about, again, I said risk management, transparency, and accountability. So from um, a accountability and liability perspective, I think about it from a old concept called the polluters pay principle, right? It's a concept that's specific to environmental law. It applies to developers and users of AI systems and how they should use financial and legal responsible harm for all their respective models. In other words, they should encourage safer development for their respective posture and their approach, right? So when I think about that, another one I would say is a clear subset of standardization, right? It's a global world. So I think about from developing global accepted standards will be crucial to managing transboundary digital risk. And then finally, I would also say um, transparency and auditing. I didn't speak to transparency, but transparency and auditing, that's also a concept of mandatory reporting. I think back to uh, the mandatory reporting rule under the then President Obama, the greenhouse gas monetary reporting rule. So when I think about decarbonization, this will also be essential as it relates to AI governance, transparency and auditing as it relates to mandatory reporting and independent audits to ensure accountability as to hold organizations steadfast as they're disclosing their reports and environmental monitoring. So that's kind of a holistic view of a approach to a very technical question.
Very well done. And thank you for bringing that down to a more general way of understanding it. I appreciate that. I appreciate the question, and I appreciate you, Professor Thomas, for giving us such a interpretable, to go back to what Terry has been saying throughout the morning, interpretable answer and something that we can take away and actually act on. Now, we are coming up on time that I want to hear from our online contributors. So I want to close out with a lightning round question. And this shouldn't be too difficult for you guys to predict what I'm going to ask of you. I would like one practical recommendation. If we were writing this framework today, I'd like to hear one recommendation to go into the framework from each of you as we close out this section of the discussion. So I would like to go in order of Sherman, Terry, Jennifer, and Thomas. One practical recommendation for our proposed framework. Sherman.
Yeah, I guess we've talked about this a lot. I guess the implementability of a framework, but I guess also measurability of what we're trying to achieve. A lot of the complexity of SDGs is because it's so intertwined. And if we don't kind of elevate ourselves from more sectoral to system level thinking, we cannot really tackle the intersectionality of the nexus between these SDGs and weigh in the trade-offs and the mutual benefits of each. So I think finding one specific social or human flourishing outcomes and trying to make sure that we measure against it when it comes to digital development and ground ourselves with it as a way to guide ourselves forward to indicate whether we're actually progressing or doing harm. I think that's one key element.
Awesome. Terry?
I don't know about practical, I'll go ambitious. This is an ambitious one of uh, a framework that requires a company to work across functions, across silos in order to work within the framework. Because what you have often with ESG frameworks and stuff, give it to the one person. Oh, we have the one ESG person, and they have to run around the company, hat in hand, begging for data and running around trying to figure things out. And they're not empowered, right? So you have this one function. So I've seen it be in HR, I've seen ESG, I've seen CSR. Um, make digital governance a whole company endeavor, right? Because it cuts across every silo. And especially when you're talking about AI and processes, they need to have an understanding of how their whole company works in order to deliver on the framework. And to be a good steward, to go beyond that, right? You have to understand how the company works, and you can't do that with an unempowered, good intentioned person running around hat in hand begging for data.
Right. Robert. I'm sorry, Jennifer, and then Robert.
I would say include key indicators such as human flourishing, perhaps looking at the gross happiness index espoused by countries like Bhutan, and also consider the environmental impact and emissions and the societal impact in terms of distribution of wealth, health, and lifespan, and so forth. So ensure to maximize key indicators for society.
Extremely important. If it matters, we measure it, we indicate it, and that is usually our compass, ethical, operational north. Robert.
Either's fine. I
Professor
was
Thomas. Let's just stick with Professor Thomas. Let's go with that.
Robert is fine, please. Robert is fine. I would say catch up with the rest of the world. Um, impose ESG regulatory requirements and standards on the US. It's kind of ambitious, right, Terry? But I think
That one's beyond me, Robert. That was much more ambitious than mine.
don't get me wrong, we have the EPA and OSHA, right? We have the Environmental Protection Agency. But I think the EU is doing it the right way. They have CSRD, and it's applicable to all countries within the EU. Same thing in the US. We need something to hold organizations accountable for the harm, the polluters pay principle. But I think if we impose a law such as CSRD in the US, it will hold organizations accountable because we have to now disclose what we're doing accordingly, not just in the 10K, but holistically our approach and our financial capital and put our money where our mouth is. So that'd be my one thing I like to see.
Great advice, both about how we can do some positive legislative work within the US, but also opening an opportunity for some diplomacy and soft power execution to encourage one of the largest influencers to behave differently. Thank you all for your contributions. I want to thank you for all the work that you've done early in the morning or late in the evening, depending on where you are, to our panelists. Thank you so much. And we are at the close of our conversation. So thank you to our contributors for their important additions and interventions. Thank you to our esteemed panel for their work and for their contributions with us today. And I do want to remind you all that, we've talked about a lot in this conversation around responsible digital governance. We've taken away concrete ideas around what should be included in benchmarks and frameworks, inclusion of conversations around accountability. We've heard practical frameworks about how compliance can feed into this concept of a digital framework. We've talked about efficiency, and even in our contributions that we don't have time to waste. We need to move forward quickly with whatever we are going to do because there are a lot of people and planet and ecosystems dependent upon what we do. So the next step is to translate these insights into not just benchmarks, but to action items for governments and for corporations. So thank you all for surfacing all of these topics. Today's conversation and contributions will be turned into an in-depth report that will go into the Global ESG Organizations magazine. So if you all are not familiar, or if you have not been following the organization on social media, I encourage you to please engage with their LinkedIn page, sign up for the newsletter, follow the leaders, make sure that you follow and connect with our wonderful leader and organizer of this entire event and orchestrator of the organization itself, Miss Jenny Tsai. And I hope to see you all at another forum and another important conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day or evening as it may be.